Not many people know about this now, but in the mid-20th century, Soviet engineers experimented a lot with plastic.
It was an attempt to respond to the Americans and their breakthrough developments.
In 1957, a plastic house of the future, a futuristic cottage, was built in Disneyland. The designer, whose project was developed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, responded by building the first prototype of an individual residential house made from new materials. It was the year 1961. The house had 2 floors, a technical floor of glass blocks and a residential floor of reinforced plastic with 14 centimeters thick walls. It's hard to believe even in our time. But even back then, more than half a century ago, absolutely everything here was made of plastic, from windows made of plexiglass to wallpaper made of polyvinyl chloride film. What's amazing is that the cost of building such housing was 3 times lower than the cost of constructing Khrushchyovkas. However, the project was never put into mass production. However, operating and maintaining the building was quite costly. Authorities also worried that this beauty would encourage a lasting artificial individualism in Soviet citizens. By looking at how housing construction developed in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you can study the history of the Soviet Union. Stalinkas, Khrushchyovkas, Brezhnevkas. Each of these housing projects had its own spirit. For what purpose? Entrances were mostly painted blue and green. Why did doors almost always open into the apartment? And why was there a window in the bathroom? In this video, we'll answer all these questions, so be sure to watch it until the end. It's going to be interesting. Before watching, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we release interesting and informative content here. With the advent of Soviet power, housing for the majority of the country's population became communal. Back then, this was called the policy of densification. Former owners had to share their living space with workers, and huge multi-family apartments appeared. They existed in the 1930s and the 1950s, and some of them can still be found even today. By the mid-1930s, when millions of people were moving from villages and rural areas to Soviet cities, the first large-scale organized housing construction in Russian history began. And this is where things start to get really interesting. During Stalin's rule, the party elite, high-ranking military officials, and representatives of the creative intelligentsia finally took shape in the state. They could hardly live in the same communal apartment with ordinary workers who had just arrived from the village yesterday. All of them needed separate housing. That's how the large-scale project to build Stalin-era houses began. Today, they're simply called Stalinkas. According to the Soviet leader's idea, it was necessary to show the world the power and greatness of the Soviet people. For those times, the buildings could be considered luxurious. Usually, such apartments had 2 to 4 rooms and a spacious hallway. Plumbing, sewage, central air conditioning. Everything was here. It is now commonly believed that during the rule of Yosif Vissarionovich, luxury and opulence could not be accessible to members of the ruling class. But that was not always the case. Personal libraries, studies, and even servants' rooms. All of this can be found in the apartments of that era. They stand out with high ceilings and kitchens that are large, even by today's standards. However, spacious kitchens can't be found in every building of that development. Even the very location of the new type of houses was no accident. Stalinka buildings were placed on the main streets of the city, at the beginning of avenues and major thoroughfares. Often, the lower floors were entirely given over to housing for service staff, cleaners, janitors, and security personnel. The buildings themselves were decorated with arches, columns, and stucco. The walls, 4 bricks thick, provided excellent sound insulation, and even the cold winter was not a problem for the residents of these apartments. A different type of Stalin-era building was offered for ordinary people. Now let's go back to Stalin-era buildings for ordinary people, not the nomenclatura elite. Life was simpler then. Communal living was common, and many apartments lacked bathtubs. Such buildings were mainly constructed in workers' settlements and in city districts intended for factory workers. Stalin-era buildings were constructed to last centuries, with a service life of about 150 years, which is why many still exist today. In the 1950s, the government issued a decree with a boring bureaucratic title about eliminating excesses in design and construction. I think many viewers have already guessed that behind this unremarkable title were truly large-scale changes. The era of Khrushchyovkas began in the Soviet Union. Here's what Khrushchev himself wrote about the wastefulness of designers from the previous era. They understand architecture too aesthetically as an artistic activity, and not as a means to meet the vital needs of the Soviet people. They spend money on unnecessary beauty that no one needs, instead of building more simply, but in greater quantity. Stalin's luxury and the decor of Soviet apartment buildings are disappearing. It is not destined to return again. Now, architects and builders of the Soviet Union have been given a different task: to build as much as possible and as cheaply as possible. The new series of houses were often panel-built. To save materials, the interior walls were only 4 centimeters thick, and the walls between apartments were 8 centimeters thick. Recipients of this housing had to give up on soundproofing and warmth in their apartments. The project of the giant House of Soviets and some other structures remained unfinished. Some of them, already without the pompous decor and architectural flourishes, were completed by 1961. But one way or another, the era changed. World War I buried hundreds of thousands of ordinary Soviet citizens' homes under its rubble. Many of them had to live in sheds and dugouts, and something urgently needed to be done about this. It's hard to believe now, but for many people at that time, the first Khrushchevkas were like a breath of fresh air. Citizens who shared a common kitchen with other families were happy to get, even if it was small, their own apartment. The classic Khrushchevka is a 5-story building with longitudinal load-bearing walls. There is no elevator, garbage chute, fire escape, or balcony. The icing on the cake was the hassle caused by the layout's walk-through room. Apparently, so that the owners of such new buildings wouldn't feel completely sad, the architects included small storage rooms, and in some series of houses, there was even a refrigerator shelf built under the kitchen windowsill. That's a Soviet-style bonus for you. This very kitchen was microscopic. A 4 to 6 square meter area barely gives the hostess enough room to move. However, Soviet planners knew what they were doing. All distances, angles, and proportions were carefully calculated, and this area is quite enough to minimally meet the needs. As for comfort, there was the bare minimum. The neglect of architectural elements in favor of practicality had an unpleasant effect on the appearance of Khrushchevkas. Gray, faceless, and shabby, they look truly awful. But no matter how terrible the quality of the housing being built was, it must be admitted that mass construction in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was ahead of its time. And even 60 years later, buildings around the world are still being built according to Soviet standards. The standardized construction of 5-story buildings solved the colossal problem of housing shortages. Khrushchev and his team managed to stop a real housing crisis. The brilliant project eliminated everyday problems for millions of families in a short time, and at the same time strengthened the urban population class of the Soviet Union. The state worked so hard to rescue people from the post-war ruins that it churned out an incredible number of Khrushchevkas. These buildings embodied the spirit of their time. No matter how you look at it, the space where we spend most of our lives changes us. By the way, what kind of building do you live in? If it's a Soviet-era building, write in the comments whether you like it or not. Or maybe you've had the chance to visit someone in a historic building? Well, let's continue. The term Brezhnevka also became common among the people. These are mass-built apartment buildings from the second generation of the post-Stalin era. These are upgraded Khrushchevkas that became taller with more floors and wider as apartments grew more spacious. These buildings are sometimes called improved ones. Ceilings are higher and kitchens larger. In some standard versions, they could be as large as 14 square meters. Owners of apartments from other projects with kitchens were less fortunate. Basically, a Brezhnevka is the average between a Stalinka with its comfortable apartments and a Khrushchevka with its affordability. Under Brezhnev, layout solutions were significantly improved. Adjoining rooms almost disappeared from the designs, garbage chutes and elevators appeared, and silicate brick began to be used in the construction of some series. Usually, only those buildings that were constructed during the rule of Leonid Ilyich were called Brezhnevkas. However, in reality, this type of construction was used right up until the mid-90s when not only Brezhnev, but even the Soviet Union itself no longer existed. The 5-story buildings were replaced by ones with 8, 9, or even 16 floors. This way, it was possible to house more people with minimal costs. Each type of building represents the era in which it was constructed, from the spacious and luxurious Stalinkas, which embody the ambitions of the leader, to the identical, cramped, in some ways even ugly, but affordable Khrushchyovkas and Brezhnevkas for ordinary people. It's important to realize the Soviet Union built both identical standard houses and remarkable buildings. This is what, for example, the Omsk Musical Theater looks like. Its shape is still debated to this day. From one angle, it's a grand piano. From another, it's a ship with a sail. And some people even call it a ski jump. Consider the Kirpati Sanatorium in Crimea. It offers a warm seawater pool, movie theater, restaurant, bars, and a library. All present, of course. But that's not the main point. Just take a look at its shape. And here's another building, the Uzbekistan Hotel. It's a huge hotel designed to accommodate participants of international competitions and conferences. National patterns are hidden between the sun-shading panels of the facade, and there were a lot of such buildings in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The triumph of Soviet engineers' imagination was reflected not only in the aesthetic appeal of their projects. Some buildings, which appeared to be civilian structures, could actually serve as bunkers or secret facilities in case of war. By the way, if you also find the topic of unusual buildings in the Soviet Union interesting for a separate video, let me know in the comments. The engineering design of Soviet houses concealed a number of secrets, many of which still spark interest even today. Most of the inconspicuous techniques and solutions were meant to help residents in their daily lives. Let's talk about them in more detail. A perfectly logical question is, why is there a window in the apartment between the bathroom and the kitchen? You can find exactly this kind of solution in some Khrushchyovkas. It's a strange design element, isn't it? There are dozens of theories about its purpose, and some of them are ridiculous. Supposedly, such a window could save the wall from collapsing in case of a household gas explosion. A more reasonable theory says that the window helped save electricity. Sunlight filled the space during the day, and in the evening the kitchen lamp lit both rooms at once. Another version says that during the Khrushchyovka construction years, the Soviet Union was battling tuberculosis, and the Koch bacillus dies when exposed to direct sunlight. And this version is quite plausible. And the window also helped visually expand the space, and Soviet building designers, of course, knew this very well. They put the window in such an unusual place for a reason. Over many years of use, residents of such apartments have managed to brick up these windows, so now it's harder to find them. They were sealed up for more than just privacy reasons. The thing is, because of this window, it was almost impossible to mount the upper part of the kitchen set. Let's move on to the entrances, which were painted specifically in blue or green. And again, there are several theories. First of all, this solution is practical. These colors don't show dirt easily, and scratches and graffiti are hard to see on them. Some sources say that blue and green pigments are the most concentrated, so this paint is used up slowly. It's worth noting that after the war, there was an abundance of green paint in warehouses, since it was used for camouflaging military equipment. By the way, only the lower part of the wall was painted, while the upper part was usually whitewashed. It's much cheaper. That's why Soviet engineers and Gosplan economists carefully calculated everything here. Almost always, the doors in Soviet houses opened inward. This was justified by safety considerations. In case of a fire or another disaster, the door could be quickly broken down from the outside to get inside. However, the KGB could also break in by knocking down the door. However, it's unlikely anything could have stopped Soviet government agency employees. You may have noticed that in Soviet-era buildings, only the edges of steps are painted. Most often, brown paint was used for this purpose. The first version says, "This recreated the Tsarist-era mansion atmosphere, with carpeted stairs in the cramped entryways of cheap apartment buildings. Supposedly, this way, the austere Soviet entrance looked more attractive and created a certain semblance of coziness." The second version is simple convenience for the cleaners. Dust and dirt accumulate specifically in the corners of the steps. Those specific corners were painted, making the surface smoother and the stairs noticeably easier to clean. Most houses built during Khrushchev's era did not have balconies on the first floor. Buildings of this type were low, with little space from the asphalt, so a balcony would simply be on the ground. In addition, people living on the first floors had easy access to the street, so they didn't need such a space. Another reason first floors lack balconies is fire safety. To be continued. This made it much faster to leave the premises in case of an emergency. Thank you for watching this video until the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There's a ton of interesting content here for every occasion, and we do our best to bring you up-to-date news and fascinating stories. See you in the next episodes.